So, good morning, good afternoon, or even good evening, again, depending what time you're listening to this recording. So, welcome to part 3 of the supply module, and we'll be talking today about shifts in supply. So, just like in demand, where there are shifts in demand, there are also shifts in supply, and we'll find that out later. So, our background today is Alexandria, which is in Egypt. And if you're a student of history, you know that the most famous thing about Alexandria was its lighthouse and the library. So the Library of Alexandria was one of the earliest libraries in the world and is also one of the biggest ones. Okay, unfortunately, we can't visit it today because it burnt down in a fire ages ago. But we'll be using concepts of supply to find out today why have books or reading in general come. It came originally from you have to build a library. You needed to have a big library built where it's an empire-wide effort, whereas now people can just have books on their own. Books are really cheap nowadays, and there's a lot of books everywhere. So we're going to be finding out why, part of the reason why this happened, and this has to do with the supply of books. But let's get to it. So let's just have a recap on the supply function. So again, the amount of goods supplied depends on the following factors. So we got the price of the good, and then we've also got the price of inputs, technology, number of firms, expectations, so on and so forth, which we'll be talking about today. And again, because we're talking about it depends on, right? So this is what we call a supply function. A function, once again, just means depends on. So the number of goods supplied depends on all these factors. All right. So again, don't panic. That's basically what it is. So it's just a function. So last time we talked about the law of supply, which tells us the relationship between the price of the good and how much of that good a supplier or producer will supply. So we saw that if we increase the price of the good, so let's say we increase that, what happens to the quantity supplied? According to the law of supply, the amount of supply, the amount of goods supplied will have to increase as well, right? I can make more money out of that because it's more expensive. I can make more money, so therefore I'll supply more. Okay, and so yeah, there we go. And again, similarly, if we decrease the price, what happens to the willingness to sell? It goes down as well. Okay, so that's from the previous lecture that we did. And of course, we can also do this graphically, right? So we have the supply curve, which again, law of supply tells us that as we increase the price, so as we go up here, the quantity supplied increases. So we got this increasing line over here. And once again, just a reminder that the supply curve, the law of supply doesn't tell us the shape of the curve, okay? As long as it's increasing. So you could have a curve that increases this way, you could have a curve that increases that way. It's all part of the supply. It all conforms to the law of supply. The only thing is, the reason why we use a straight line is it's easier that way. Okay. Alright, so let's have a look at the supply function once again. So last time, again, we looked at the effect of price, right? And that's what gave us the law of supply. Now, this time we will look at the effect of non-price factors. And just as a recap from the demand module, recall that non-price factors include the price of other goods. Okay, as long as it's not the good in question. For example, if we got a pizza, we're looking at the price of we're looking at the supply of pizza. That's our good that we're analyzing. The price of inputs like tomatoes, milk, cheese, whatever that goes into the pizza, those are also called non-price factors because it's not about the actual price of the pizza which we're analyzing. Okay, so just remember that non-price factors can include prices as long as it's not the price of the good itself. Okay. So there we go. There's the warning there. And so yeah. So what happens when we change all the other stuff? And again, we'll be taking ceteris paribus, meaning one thing at a time. All right. So we'll only change one factor at a time and see what happens to the supply of that good. Okay. I hope that is clear. So just another recap, movement versus shift. All right, so this is the same as in demand. So we've got two things that could happen when there's a change in the inputs towards when there's a change in the supply function. So there's a movement along the supply curve, and just like in demand, this is when the price changes, the price of the good. Okay, so this causes a change in the quantity supplied. And again, the supply curve is still the same after a movement. So prices change and we either move up or down the supply curve. All right. Contrast that with a shift of the supply curve, where this is where a non-price factor changes. And again, non-price means anything as long as it's not the price of the good in question. And when that non-price factor changes, the whole supply curve shifts. Okay, it changes. All right. When we say that the supply changes. So movement, change in the quantity supplied, and shift of the supply curve. That means the actual whole supply changes. We will get a new supply curve. All right. And again, let's just have an animation just to show you the difference. All right. So on the left we got movement. So once again, x-axis we got quantity supplied, and on the y-axis we got the price. And again, our supply curve, it just goes up because again, law of supply. So let's say we have an original price of this and we got a quantity supplied of this. Okay. And now movement just means we either go up or down along the curve. And note, we still have the exact same curve. There's no new curve. We just go up and down in the same curve. That's what we call movement. All right. And now shift, let's draw our axes again, and that's our original supply curve. Shift is, notice now we can either shift to the right or shift to the left. So what happens here in shift is that there's actually a new supply curve being made. All right, and let's just have these animations both at the same time so you can see the difference. All right, I hope that's very clear. And again, this happens only when there's a change in price, and this happens whenever there's a change in non-price factors. Okay, I hope that's clear. So here is a quick one that's in your notes. Basically, a non-animated version of that. So the red is the new, and the black one for this one is the old one. So there's the old price, new price. We just moved along the curve, still the same curve. And shift, we got the old curve and we shifted that curve, and now we got the red curve, which is our new curve. All right. I hope that's clear. And again, this is exactly the same as in demand. Okay. The only difference in demand is that the curve is sloping downwards instead of upwards. Okay. I hope that makes sense. All right. So let's have a look now at the different things in the supply function. All right, so we'll start first with the price of inputs, and I do apologize if you're watching this in the middle of the night and you suddenly get a craving for pizza, because we'll be using pizza as an example. Oh, look at that, how delicious. So what happens to the supply of pizza if tomatoes become more expensive? Okay, and remember, we're taking a ceteris paribus approach. We're only changing one thing at a time. So the thing we're changing now is the price of the inputs, which is tomatoes, right? And just as a reminder from the production module, again, we got 4 factors of production. We've got land, labor, capital, and entrepreneurship. And all of these combine together to form our pizza, right? Okay, let's have a look. So, tomatoes, that's part of land. What happens when the price increases? Okay, let's have a quick think of certain ideas that we could have. Well, first thing that might come into your mind, well, you know, if I want to maintain profits, I can maybe increase the price of pizza, right? Well, here's a problem. So let's increase the price of pizza so that we could cover the price of more expensive tomatoes. Here's a problem. Ceteris paribus. We cannot change the price of the good, because again, we're looking at things one at a time. We cannot change another factor, right? Because ceteris paribus. Next. So we can't do that. Next, what if we decrease the price of other output? So let's say, you know, I'll decrease the price of labor. I'll hire less people. Here's the problem. If the current production is already efficient, we cannot do that. Again, if your production is already efficient, right? You've got the right amount of workers, you've got the most efficient amount of workers, then the price of tomatoes shouldn't influence that. If there's a way to make things more optimized, you've already an efficient business would have already gone for that. So therefore, we can't lower the price of any other output, any other input as well. Okay, so now what do we do? The only thing we could do is we have to decrease the production of pizza. So we reduce the quantity of pizza. And again, you can't just also say, well, maybe we could just decrease profits. Well, you can. However, got to remember, that's also an input here. So the only choice you have really is to decrease the quantity of pizza that you produce, because tomatoes are more expensive. Yeah, okay. So if we saw here that the price of tomatoes, right, the price of the inputs increases. the quantity of the pizza, our supply of pizza, decreases. And again, price of inputs increase, the supply decreases. So there's an inverse relationship between the two. All right, so if we want to put this on the supply curve, what happens? So that's our original supply curve. If the price of inputs increase, notice what happens to supply? It decreases. So our supply curve will shift to the left. Okay, I hope that's clear. So what happens if it's the other way around? What happens if tomatoes become cheaper? So now the price of tomatoes goes down, the price of input, an input which is land, goes down. So the price of tomatoes go down, and again, same thing, right? We can't change the price of the pizza, we can't change the price of labor or any other input. So what we do, we increase the production of pizza. Okay, so if we saw that if we decrease the price of inputs, the supply increases. And again, if we have our supply curve right there, if we decrease the price of the inputs, what happens to this supply curve? It shifts to the right, because now for the same price of pizza, we can now supply more because our inputs are cheaper. Okay, I hope that's clear. So now we get to the book question. We get to technology. Okay. So here's a question. Why did Europe suddenly have more books starting in the 15th century? And here's a graph to show that. So books and manuscripts, again, manuscripts basically just means handwritten books, but they're basically much the same. So if you notice, there's a steady increase, okay? So by the way, this is a log scale. So any increase here means a huge increase. And look at that jump. In the 15th century, look at that jump that we have about the amount of books that Europe produces. Okay, so why? Why is there a sudden jump? That the more books start getting produced, starting in the 15th century. And if you know your history, you'd know pretty much it's down to the most common invention that people cite is the printing press, Gutenberg's printing press. So that was around that time, the 15th century, when the printing press started, which means that now you could mass produce books. However, another thing most people forget is paper. So paper is another technology that allowed for massive book production, because before paper was introduced, people wrote in papyrus, and it was really hard or papyrus or parchment, and it was a tedious process to make papyrus or parchment. Whereas when paper arrived, it was much easier to get things on record. Okay, so that's an explanation of why did Europe suddenly have more books in the 15th century. It's because of the printing press and paper, okay, those twin inventions. So that is technology. And so before the printing press was invented, people had to manually write down books, okay? So you'd have scribes, and literally you'd have a guy just copying a book from another book. Literally, that's how they used to do it before. And now look at what we're doing. Okay, so can you imagine the difference in time frames and the amount of manpower needed to create a book before the printing press was invented compared to what we have today? All right, so you can see the vast difference in the speed and the amount of manpower required to create a book. All right, so let's have a look at the effect of technology. So technology improves, and what happens next? Production becomes more efficient, right? You can see that with the printing press. Before, people had to write down manually books, and now with the printing press, what happens? You just literally push down some sort of you basically press down the press, and then you get a book out, or you get a page out, right? So production becomes more efficient. That saves so much manpower time. And what happens next? More product. You get more product from the same amount of output. If you got a worker working in an hour, right? If that guy had to write down a book within an hour, that guy probably would have written down, I don't know, 3-4 pages. Whereas okay, maybe a lot more than that. But if you had a printing press, what happens? The guy literally just has to stamp out a book, and within an hour, he could, probably, depending on how quickly he can press and, how much waiting time there's, could probably print out like 100 or 200 pages. So you can see the difference, right? That's like 10 times more. And so what happens? Supply increases, right? Because now we got the same number of inputs. The number of inputs didn't change. It's just that what each input produces, what each manpower, manpower hour produces, there's more to it. Okay, so that's what happens. And if we got the supply curve right here again, and again, we'd always refer to the supply curve. Technology improves, we increase supply. That means the curve shifts to the right, because now we have more. Okay, I hope that's clear. So in what way can technology help? So as we've said already, right? Technology improves supply or increases supply mainly by increasing the efficiency of an input. Okay, so we've looked at labor, let's say, right? For the same hour of labor that you get, you can now produce more books. Okay, because again, you're more efficient. But there's also other ways. Let's say talk about land. You might say, well, potatoes, for example, or food. I have the same amount of food anyways, so how does that work? Well, it's all about waste. So have a look at here. So I actually thought of this while I was peeling potatoes the other day. Somebody who's if you have a more efficient peeler, let's say, compared to just a knife, that means you'd have less potato peels, which again you just throw away. So even from the same potato, from the same input, that means you can actually have more. So let's say you're making fries. That means, so you're making fries, so you have to peel a potato and then cut it. Let's say you don't like skin on fries. So what happens here is that when you peel the potato, some of the potato comes with a peel, right? That's what it is. If you have a more efficient peeler compared, let's say you had a knife and then now you have a peeler, with a knife there'll be more waste, right? More potato will stick to the peel. But with the peeler, what happens now is that you have less of the potato. So maybe that will give you an extra fry. So from the same input, right, you now have more fries. Okay, so that's what technology does to us. It also allows us to avoid waste. Okay, so for example, look at this moldy tomato here. You can't use that anymore, right? If, for example, before refrigeration, if you had all these tomatoes, you had all of them after harvest, you can't store them, what happens? They all go to waste. So you have those inputs that are not even, by the way, you still buy these inputs, right? Because you've got to make them, but without refrigeration, they just spoil. So you have the same number of inputs, it's just that some of those inputs don't go to waste anymore with technology. With the advent of refrigeration, that means we don't have to waste as many produce as before. And then it's the same way with sushi restaurants even. You know those conveyor belt types? Yeah, where you just get the sushi that you want. What happens if at the end of the day those sushis don't get eaten? They either go to waste or, the crew could take them home, but they don't really pay for that because it's not their fault, right? That they produced that customers were not able to get everything. So with improvement in technology, with improvement in, say, data processing, predictions, now we can predict better what customers will want and will produce just the right amount. We'll have less waste. And so you've got the same number of inputs, but because of technology, those inputs are either wasted less or that we can get more from that same input. Okay, so that's basically what technology does. So what constitutes technology? What are the forms of it? So we've seen the printing press, we've seen machineries, knives, peelers, and all of that. So that's one form of technology, and that's usually what we associate. However, that's not enough. Okay, there's other ways that technology could improve. There's data, and again, we've seen this with a sushi example. The better data you have, the less waste you could, you could produce more to make sure there's no waste. So better data, better software, all these things make things more efficient, and that's all part of technology. Other things, you can have skill, and this is one of the surprising things. Before the advent of the Industrial Revolution, most learning took place with just people becoming more skilled, right? So for example, let's go back to the peeling potatoes example. Somebody who's an expert peeler through practice and training could probably be more efficient in peeling potatoes and producing less waste, right? So there's that skill. So so skill in work is also part of technology because it allows us to produce more, right, from the same worker. There's also organization. This is a picture of Factorio. So the way we lay things out okay, allows us to, let's say, for example, one of the stories I remember was Domino's. Domino's used to have this 30-minute guaranteed delivery, and the way they did that was they tried to improve the layout of the kitchen. So that means if you wanted to, from the oven, if from preparing the pizza to putting in the oven, there's be less time walking, and that saves, a certain amount of time. So even simple things as layouting, okay, can save time, and that's all part of technology. And also in the management side, you can have better management. You can organize things better so that things flow more efficiently, less red tape, less inefficiency. That's all part of technology. So better management practices, so technology isn't just confined to actual machineries like this that we think of. It could include, softer things like software, like labor skills, and organizations and management. All right, so that's all part of technology. Now, usually, right, we have these two sides of the coin. There's always something that shifts the supply curve to the right and shifts and the opposite that shifts it to the left, or vice versa. So, technology, can we lose technology? In other words, is technological regress even possible? Yes, it is. Okay, so if, let's say, you got something burnt down, right? This is a picture of the Great Fire of London. If you got your machine breaking down or something burning down, what happens? Technological regress, right? Your machinery, it disappears. Sometimes the technology is still there, but the actual capital that you have isn't there anymore. This is more salient when the Roman Empire fell, right? So with the fall of Roman Empire, a lot of technologies were lost. For example, was it concrete? Yeah, I think it was concrete. We lost the ability to make concrete, and it wasn't rediscovered until hundreds of years later on. So yes, it is possible for us to forget. Okay, but these are like hard good technologies. You could also have soft skill technologies like people's skills. People could retire. For example, the expert potato peeler, he could, grow old and decide to retire, and that means, you've basically lost that skill. You've lost that technology because now you have to train another new person to be just as efficient. So for the time being, while you're training them, the you know technology goes down. So technological regress is possible in more ways than one. You could have something as big as, an empire collapsing and us losing technology, but it's also possible for something as simple as this person retired and he has the knowledge of doing X, Y, and Z, and now that he's retired, we've lost that, okay, or it's not easily transferable. All right. So in the supply curve, so that's our original supply curve. If technology regresses, we can supply less because now it takes more. We have more waste from inputs. We've got more, basically, less efficiency. Things are more inefficient. Things are inefficient, and so supply curve shifts to the left. We have less supply. Okay, there's a decrease in supply. Okay, I hope that's clear. So we now go to the third factor, which is the number of firms. Okay, this is the third non-price factor. So we've covered price of inputs, technology, and now we've got the number of firms. All right, so going back to the graph that we had before about book production and manuscript production, why was manuscript production still increasing even before the printing press, right? We understood that there was an improvement in technology. That's why there's this jump over here. That explains this jump, partly. All right. So what about this one? There's still an increase, and again, log scale. So any increase here would be huge. Not as huge as like this jump here, but it's still rather huge. So why was there still an increase in the production of books even before the printing press? Okay, mainly it's because more people were producing books. So who were producing books? Usually monasteries, right? So basically these are the monks or the guys who decide to live in secluded areas, or even sometimes people in the city, but they've taken a vow to God and they've decided to go to a monastery. Now, these guys are usually the ones who produce books, usually the Bible or other religious texts. So if you notice here, the number of course, as Europe, throughout the centuries, there were more and more monasteries. Okay, as Europe expanded and Christianity expanded, a lot of people and monasticism became a big thing at that point in time. More monasteries were being set up, and so that meant that there were more books that could be produced because there were more scribes, right? So basically, the number of people producing books increased during before the printing press came to Europe, and um, that's why book production was still increasing even before the printing press came in. But let's have another example just to hammer this point in. So let's have an effect of the number of firms, and we'll talk about farming, okay? Because it's very simple. So let's say we got a farm, and the farm produces, let's say, one, I don't know, acre corn or whatever it is. Okay, so let's have that. Let's just use the symbols. So if we have more farms, and each farm produces one of these corn, what happens? More farms mean more corn, right? We increase the number of farms, we increase the number of corn. Simple. Number of firms, so this is like the number of firms, and this is the supply. Okay, so number of farms, we increase that. Corn production, that increases as well. Okay, and in bigger terms, more general terms, the number of firms, suppliers, and again, farms are suppliers of corn, basically. If we increase that, what happens? The supply increases as well. And in terms of our supply curve, if this is our original supply curve, if the number of firms increase suddenly, then we see an increase. We see a shift to the right of the supply curve, i.e., supply increases. All right. Okay, let's have a look at the other side. What happens if number of farms decrease? So that means there will be less corn, right? Because there's less farms to produce corn. So number of farms, if the number of farms go down, the corn production goes down as well. And if we got so in general terms, if the number of firms, suppliers, again, farms are just suppliers of corn, if that goes down, supply goes down. And again, let's just bring back our supply curve. If the number of firms decrease, we get a shift to the left. Okay, I hope that's pretty straightforward enough. All right. All right, now we've got expectations. So this is the So this is the next one in our list, and again, just like demand, I'm gonna use toilet paper as an example for this because it's generally the easiest one to do, especially at this time of a pandemic just coming in, right? So it's the easiest one. All right, let's have a look. How would a supplier of toilet paper think when another lockdown is on the horizon? Let's say, second wave is coming in, just like when I'm recording this, as at the time recording, Europe is entering its second wave. Well, it's already in the middle of the second wave right now. What happens when another lockdown is on the horizon, when there are plans of lockdown? Okay, so let's think of how a supplier would think, and normally would. So first thought, well, last time, we already saw that people panic bought toilet paper when the lockdown was near, right? So when there was a lockdown, people panic bought and toilet paper was gone. So first thing, well, if there's another lockdown, people might panic buy again, right? It's possible that they might panic again and start buying toilet paper. But if panic buying creates a shortage, well, panic buying creates a shortage, right? Which can increase the price of toilet paper. Now, if I know that price of toilet paper is going to increase, what do? Higher prices mean higher profit. I should probably produce more then. So notice here, at this stage, the price has not yet risen. There's only the expectation that the price of toilet paper is going to increase. But basically, you're going ahead of the market, right? You're going to think, well, I think the price is going to increase, and I just want to be prepared that by the time the price increases, I'll have more toilet paper to sell. Okay, and again, this doesn't work with all types of goods, because, for example, if we got perishables, let's say food, increasing production of food to meet the demands of, let's say, what's 2 years from now, the food will probably spoil. Whereas toilet paper, because it's not perishable that much, I could, I could produce more in expectation of of a price increase later on. Okay, so this is the thing. Price has not yet risen. So this is actually a non-price factor because the price of the good has not yet increased. It's just the expectation of the price. Okay, so in terms of the supply curve, if expectations are good, if I think the price of toilet paper will increase, then I'm going to produce more, which means supply will increase, shift to the right. Okay, Now, if expectations are bad, let's say, we're getting out of lockdown, and let's say, or maybe there's this whole new expectation that bidets are going to be the big thing, and so you don't need toilet paper anymore. Expectations are bad. What happens? The supply curves shifts to the left because companies will probably produce less. Okay, so that's the effect of expectations. And we get now to natural social factors. Okay, I know the video is a bit longer than the previous two, so bear with me here. We've got a couple more, and hopefully that will be good. So we got natural social factors, and these are ones that are pretty easy. Okay, so we got a picture of a drought here. So what happens to food production when there's a drought? You got less water, plants, basically die out. Some of them don't last. So for example, there's a tomato plant. So we've been talking about our tomatoes today, and so notice basically when there's a drought, there's less nutrients for the soil. What happens to food production? They can't produce, a plant can't produce as much. Again, you could increase inputs, you can increase like irrigation and all of that, but again, that has a cost. And again, we're taking ceteris paribus. What happens when just this one factor changes? So naturally, when there's a drought, plants produce less. So what happens? Supply goes down. Right? Simple as that. So this is our supply curve here, our original supply curve. If a drought happens, food production shifts to the left. There's less produce per plant. Simple as that. Okay. Now, there's also social factors. So this is a picture of the Yom Kippur War in 1973. And 1973 is an important year for oil because this is one of the first times when we had an oil crisis. So just a background, the history. So the Yom Kippur War was a war against several Middle Eastern countries against Israel. Okay, and so what happened was the United States decided to support Israel, and because of that, there was an embargo. Embargo means no trading. So most of the oil-producing countries in the world are in the Middle East, right? Most of the Arab nations. Now, what happened was because of the US involvement in the war, the Arab nations said, we will not export any more oil to you. So what happens? So this is a social factor because it's a war, right? This happened. Gas shortage or petrol shortage everywhere. All right, because there was now less oil going around because now the oil producing companies are saying no, we will not export any more oil to you. And now the 1973 oil crisis, as it was called, is actually a huge thing in America, and it actually produced this whole policy of America. Ever since then, America's been trying to be more independent when it comes to the oil supply. Okay, because this really was a bad time, and basically at this point in time, oil was just oil supply was at a very low, and prices just skyrocketed and all of that. So what happened with the war that produced the oil crisis? So if this is our original supply of oil, because of the whole crisis, there was now less. So there was a huge shift of the supply curve to the left because now there was less oil. And so if you wanted my oil, you better pay more for that because there's less where that's coming from. Okay, so those are natural or social factors. And again, there can also be other good factors that get involved, but this is just to show that these are other factors that could really severely affect supply. So for example, COVID-19 has put a strain on a lot of supplies, the supplies of a lot of goods, mainly because for one, it's not just people are buying more of like hand sanitizer and all of these things, but it's also in some cases people can't go to work, so the supply has actually gone down. So these kinds of factors do come into play. Okay, so that's also important. Now we get to the last two, which is profitability of other goods in production and joint production. Now these ones are a bit more tricky because they're basically like complements and substitutes in demand. Okay, so we're looking at the price of other goods that are not inputs but are something else entirely. Okay, so please bear with me here. I'm going to try to explain this slowly, but hopefully the animations will be helpful and the illustrations. So let's return to the first session where we talk about coffee, right? So at the beginning we talked about how a coffee farmer might be able to produce bananas instead, because that's another good in production that he can do with his land. So let's have a look at that. So let's talk about Bob and his farm. Now let's say Bob has I don't know, 8 pieces of land, okay, and he can choose whatever he wants to plant in these plots of land. Okay, and let's say in the beginning we got 2 goods only to make things simpler. So he could either grow coffee beans or he could either grow bananas. Okay, if you put a banana here, you can't put a coffee bean there because it's already occupied, and if you put a coffee bean there, you can't grow a banana, or vice versa. Okay, yeah. So let's say originally he just produces coffee beans, all right, all 8 plots coffee beans, because that's the default, right? So let's say he does that. So what happens then if the price of bananas go up? And I just want you to know, bananas are not an input for coffee beans, okay? So you don't need bananas to produce coffee beans, if I got my agriculture correct, okay? So this is not an input, okay? So what happens, however, is that bananas are a different thing. It's called other goods in production. So if the price of bananas increase, what would you think would happen? Well, Bob will be tempted to plant more bananas, right? Because it's more profitable to plant bananas because the price of bananas increase. So what he does is he plants more bananas. So the banana supply goes up. Okay, lot of supply. However, here's the problem. You only have 8 plots of land. And if you plant a banana here, you need to take out the coffee bean. So instead of planting coffee, you now plant bananas. So what happens to the coffee bean supply? Before we increased the price of bananas, there were 8 coffee beans, and now there's only 5. Okay, so the coffee bean supply goes down, and that's what we call opportunity cost, because I can't plant both bananas and coffee beans. Now, if I think bananas are going to be more profitable for this plot of land, then I'm going to plant bananas instead of coffee beans, which means the coffee bean supply will go down. So that's what we call other goods in production. When you've got a single piece of land, or you say you've got a factory that could produce one of 2 or more goods, and if one good becomes more profitable, I'll probably produce less of the other good. So if bananas become more profitable, I'll probably produce less coffee beans because I only have the same plot. They can't share the land. It's either banana or a coffee bean in that particular plot. Okay? So in terms of the supply curve, and again, I'll just be very careful here that I just can't say quantity supplied. I'm going to say quantity of coffee beans supplied and price of coffee beans. Because again, we're not looking at, so we're looking at the effect of the change in the price of bananas, but the supply curve, the thing we're analyzing, the good we're analyzing is coffee beans, not bananas, okay? So that's just how I set it up. So that's the supply curve originally. Again, that's price versus quantity of coffee beans, okay? And this is non-price factor because we're not changing the price of the coffee bean, we're changing the price of bananas. If the price of bananas increase, as we saw from this logic here, what happens to the coffee bean supply? It decreases, which means we shift to the left, okay? I hope that's clear. So because the price of bananas increase, it's more lucrative, it's more profitable to produce bananas. I'll produce more bananas, but at opportunity cost, I need to produce less coffee beans to produce more bananas. Therefore, the supply of coffee beans decreases. Okay? Now, the other way around happens as well. If the price of bananas decrease, it becomes less profitable. So why am I going to produce that? So I'm not going to plant bananas anymore. Banana supply will go down. And hey, look, I now have 3 extra plots to plant coffee beans, so I'll just plant coffee beans instead. So if the price of bananas decrease, okay, and again, we're still looking at the same supply curve, coffee bean price versus coffee bean quantity of coffee beans supplied, still same supply curve. The price of bananas decrease, what happens? The curve shifts to the right because now there's more coffee beans in production because bananas are just not that profitable. Coffee beans are probably more profitable, so I'll plant more coffee beans instead of bananas. Okay, I hope that makes sense. Now, prices of goods in joint supply. So this is a different thing, okay? So before, you had a piece of land where you could either plant bananas or coffee beans. You could either make product A or product B. Now, we're going to see what happens if we have a joint supply. So what exactly is joint supply? And this is a picture of wool, if you haven't guessed. So this is usually a typical example. So let's have a sheep. Now, a sheep could produce several things, but for the purposes of our discussion, sheep can produce wool or milk. Yeah, okay, maybe you want sheep's milk. It's a thing. Now, notice it comes from the same sheep. However, wool, right, comes from the outside and of the sheep. You shear it, and milk comes elsewhere in the sheep. So you have the same sheep, right? If you increase the number of sheep that you have, you're going to get more wool. But at the same time, you're also going to get more milk, right? Because these two things don't compete with each other. Having more sheep just means you get both more wool and more milk. Because, again, it's not one or the other. A sheep can't produce... If a sheep produces more wool, it doesn't mean it's going to produce less milk, right? So that's what we call joint supply. So producing more of one means producing more of the other. Because if I have more sheep, that means I have more wool, which means I'll probably have more milk. Okay, so that's what it is. So that's what joint supply means. From the same input, I can get two or more goods, and these goods don't compete with each other. Compared to like the banana coffee bean example, they're not competing. Wool and milk are not competing for the same sheep. Like they happily live together in the same sheep, and then when you got more sheep, then you got more wool and you got more milk. Okay. And similarly, if you decrease the number of sheep, then you get less wool and also less milk. So that's what happens. Okay, let's have a look now. Let's say we're talking about the price of milk. Let's say this is our analysis, our good that we want to analyze. But let's look first at what happens when the price of wool changes. So this is our thing that we're analyzing, and this is the thing that's affecting the price of this, affecting the supply of this thing. So again, non-price factor, even though it is a price. Okay, so if we increase the price of wool, what do you think happens to the supply of wool? Okay, low supply for wool, right? If we increase price, what happens to supply? We increase, right? It's more profitable that way. So wool prices increase. So the quantity supplied of wool increases. Well, how do you increase the supply of wool? You have to increase the supply of sheep. You just have more sheep, so you can produce more wool. Simple as that. However, you already have more sheep, so that means what happens to milk, right? Sheep's milk will also go up because by virtue of having more sheep, right? I need more sheep to create more wool, and it just so happens sheep produce milk. Oh, hey, I got more milk. So supply of sheep's milk also increase. Now let's look at what happens the other way around. If the price of wool decreases, what happens to the supply of wool? Again, low supply. If price goes down, then as a seller, I'm willing to sell less, therefore I'll produce less, right? So what happens to sheep? Well, I probably won't need that much sheep, so I'll probably downgrade, right? Because I don't need that much wool. And just the supply of sheep's milk, because I now have less sheep, what happens to this? It just decreases as well, okay? By virtue of having less sheep, okay? I hope that's very straightforward, but yeah, that's what it is. And so let's have a look at that in terms of the supply curve. So again, we're looking here, the good in question is sheep's milk, okay? Wool is the thing that changes, the price of wool is the thing that changes, but we're looking at the supply curve of sheep's milk. Again, it can get really confusing fast, but I hope you just keep note of that, which one we're actually analyzing and which one is changing the thing we're analyzing, okay? So that's our original supply curve. So if the price of wool decreases, what did we see? Well, if wool decreases, sheep decrease, supply decreases, sheep's decrease, which means we'll probably have less sheep's milk, right? So we get a shift to the left. And on the other hand, if the price of wool increases, then that means we get a shift to the right, because we'll probably produce more, we'll want more sheep to produce more wool, and it just so happens, oh look, they produce milk, we got more milk. Okay, so it shifts to the right. So again, as usual, I produce a summary of everything that we discussed in this lesson. Thank you for bearing with me, and those will be in the notes. So thank you very much for listening, and I'll see you all in the next module when we talk about what happens when we combine both supply and demand. Thank you. And again, just some image credits as usual.